especially in urban spaces, we feel lonelier than we ever have been. This was something that the NPR published, mentioning this idea of human to human loneliness, but there's also discussion sort of on species loneliness, which is a little bit less mainstream. Ecological restoration is not just the physical act of ecological restoration, but also this mental act of restoring within ourselves what ecology can be. To keep it super high level, redlining was a process that began in the late 1920s, early 1930s, around the time that the American government was writing up the New Deal. Redlining became an act or practice wherein places were purposefully divested from, or there was no investment put into those communities, which was first economically and people not building buildings and putting money in terms of retail into those areas, not giving members of those communities loans to buy homes and to invest in their communities. But then, from an ecological standpoint, if you don't have people living in those places with money and you purposefully divest from these areas, then even simple things like taking care of plants and whatnot as you're paving over the, I'll say, wildlife of that area, as you pave over that with concrete and whatnot, then there is no opportunity for the ecology really to flourish in those areas. And so as generations pass, there is less of an opportunity for trees or even moss or grasses or bushes or saplings or whatever the case may be to grow up in those areas. And that's why you saw a lot of articles being published when discussions on redlining became mainstream. This difference between tree cover in communities that were redlined versus communities that were not redlined historically, which in some instances people have termed that green lining. Trees are, as I mentioned in the article, important for shade and things like that, especially in places that were historically redlined, where this heat island effect is particularly troublesome. That relationship between class divides and increasing wealth gaps the world over and access to ecology or access to open spaces was one of my motivations for writing this article, especially in urban spaces. We feel lonelier than we ever have been. This was something that the NPR published, mentioning this idea of human to human loneliness, but there's also discussion sort of on species loneliness, which is a little bit less mainstream, wherein people just feel like, are we alone? Are we able to connect with the nature or with nature that is always around us? Not that we're just a part of that describes our home, but processes that we are, a part of, whether we live in places that are covered with concrete or we live in places that are green. And for me, I sort of wanted to begin to write this article to imagine in my own way to plant a tree within my own mind in a way in which we might break this connection between intergenerational wealth gaps and these growing disparities in access to nature by envisioning a way in which we can bring forth the forests in areas that have been historically divested by breaking up this concrete and allowing ecology to grow forth through that, whether that's through the natural process of succession, wherein lichens and then mats of moss and then grasses and shrubs and saplings grow up into the forest that we, appreciate at the most iconic scale, that being the Amazon rainforest, or if that just becomes a different type of ecology that we have yet to be able to really experience within urban landscapes to see what that might look like. But for a while there, people were planting trees in areas where there already were trees because people who are around nature appreciate it more and thus can advocate for more nature or more greenery around them, right? And then people who don't have access to it are likely not going to advocate for it. So how can we go about bringing forth greenery and the ecology of areas where there isn't any to make it so that people can see themselves within wildlife and see themselves within natural processes? If you can appreciate diversity at a small and seemingly inconsequential scale with a few native plants in your backyard, then it becomes much easier to appreciate that at the ecosystem scale of cities in the process of. So ecological restoration is not just the physical act of ecological restoration, but also this mental act of restoring within ourselves what ecology can be.